It's the real news. I'm Aaron Mate. Of all the foreign countries involved in the Syrian proxy war, one that does not get much attention is Israel. We've known for years Israel has provided at least some support to anti-Assad Sunni fighters. This includes offering medical treatment to wounded al-Qaeda fighters. Well, now a new report reveals a whole lot more. According to Syria Deeply, Israel has carried out an extensive operation backing militant groups near the border with northern Israel. This includes the provision of supplies and even direct financial aid. The report is called Israel's Quiet Campaign to Gain a Foothold in Southern Syria. It's by Nour Samaha, a freelance journalist based in Beirut, and I spoke to her earlier today. Nour, welcome.
Thank you.
So we've known about Israel's cooperation with or tacit support for al-Nusra rebels in southern Syria for quite some time. But most of the focus has been on basically Israel treating wounded fighters in its hospitals. Your piece, though, goes into detail that I don't think we've heard before, at least for a Western audience. Can you explain what you found?
Well, first off, it needs to be highlighted that it's not just Nusra rebels Nusra fighters that they're treating, but obviously a variety of opposition rebels that are based in opposition-controlled Quneitra, which is along the border or along the technical fence with Israel. What the Israelis have been doing, and they've been doing it for several years now, is reaching out beyond humanitarian aid or medical support for fighters, but also distributing aid and educational equipment inside opposition-controlled Quneitra, as well as more recently funding and arming their own opposition group. And that opposition group is called the Golan Knights, or Fursan al-Jolan in Arabic, and they're still relatively small, but they have admitted to accepting aid and arms from the Israelis, and this is the first time that this sort of information has come out publicly. And I think essentially what it is showing is that the Israelis, although they're working quite quietly and they still maintain this policy of non-involvement inside Syria, are actually working very, very actively inside southern Syria in order to create an Israeli-friendly zone of influence. And I think it's, again, important to point out that not only is this reminiscent of what they did in Lebanon during the civil war, but they're very keen on on ensuring that there's a buffer zone or a safe zone between them and the Syrian forces and the Syrian government and its allies. And in order to do that, they need to be able to make sure that the population, the local population in that area, can help them out and is not hostile towards them.
Can you explain further in terms of wanting to create that friendly buffer zone inside Syria? Because it's very significant, especially bringing up the comparison to southern Lebanon, where Israeli support for militant forces there has had deadly consequences.
Well, in southern Lebanon, basically what they did at the beginning of the war was they created this, it's called the good fence policy. So the idea was that they set up a liaison unit on the Israeli side of the border, and they basically had an open door policy for Lebanese to come into Israel to receive free medical care, to help them out in terms of employment. And eventually what it did was it opened up the possibility for the Israelis to actually be present inside Lebanon, and they then created their own militia, which was the Free Lebanon Army, and then they changed it to the South Lebanon Army. And this militia basically controlled southern Lebanon under Israeli guidance, and the South Lebanon Army and the Israelis were working side by side inside southern Lebanon in order to ensure that it was an area that was productive and helpful for the Israelis. Now, what we're seeing in Syria is something very, very similar to what they did in southern Lebanon. They want to create this Israel-friendly zone. I think I think they've learned from their mistakes in Lebanon. I do not think that the Israelis are keen on putting boots on the ground inside Syria. So what they would rather have are people that do their bidding for them. So what we're seeing are buses going in and out on a daily basis, bringing in injured and wounded and sick from opposition-held southern Syria into Israel, and you have civilians and fighters that can stay up to a year and a half inside Israeli hospitals, and they're creating this relationship with the population in order to, like I said, in order to have this Israel-friendly environment, Israel-friendly society.
Part of that, I imagine, for Israel too, is establishing a buffer zone that would help it consolidate its annexation of the Golan Heights, which it occupied 50 years ago in 1967.
100%. I mean, it's an absolute, it's a great plan for the Israelis, if you will, because, like you said, they've occupied the Golan Heights. They consider it to be annexed and part of Israel. The international community has not recognized that. They do consider it to be occupied and that it is originally Syrian territory and should be returned back to Syria. And what the Israelis are trying to do with this buffer zone, or with this Israel-friendly zone, is again create distance between the Syrian government and where they're based, and where the Israelis are. And in any future negotiations, this will only go further to cement Israel's claim over the Golan Heights. Even now they're using the argument of Syria's unstable. It's very unclear the direction that it's going to go in. The Golan Heights that's with us is stable. We're investing. We're helping the people. Why would, after 50 years or even longer, would we return it back to Syria? It should stay with us and it belongs to us. So having this zone or this area only further, again, puts distance between the Israelis and the Syrian government and its forces on the ground, which again helps serve their argument.
I want to play for you the comment of Ephraim Halevi. He's the former head of Israel's intelligence agency, Mossad. And he was interviewed by Al Jazeera and asked about Israel treating wounded al-Nusra or al-Qaeda fighters in Israeli hospitals. This is what he said.
Do those reports worry you that Israel's helping wounded al-Qaeda-aligned fighters?
As I said before, in a different context, it's always useful also to deal with your enemies in a humane way.
I mean, you know better than me the phrase blowback. You don't think there's going to be blowback against Israel if you get into bed with a group like Nusra Front?
No, I don't think so. I don't think there's going to be blowback.
Why?
Because I think that, unfortunately, the rules of the game in Syria are such that you can do anything that is not possible to be done anywhere else.
Yeah, I think people said that in Afghanistan too. Would you also treat Hezbollah fighters?
No.
That's Ephraim Halevi, former head of Israel's intelligence agency, Mossad. He was speaking to Al Jazeera's Mehdi Hassan. Nour, interesting there that he dismisses the potential for blowback from al-Nusra, and also says that despite extolling the principle of treating your enemies, he wouldn't treat Hezbollah, just al-Qaeda.
I mean, it's an Israeli policy, and also has al-Nusra and the opposition in southern Syria have done absolutely nothing to indicate that they would be any threat whatsoever to the Israelis. So, and the Israelis have worked very closely and very diligently to make sure that these people would not have any sort of impact on Israel. And I think we've seen that very clearly on the ground. There have been no attacks at all from the opposition onto Israel. And again, from the sources that I have from both the opposition and from the government side, it's not in their interest to enter into a war with the Israelis. So as far as the Israelis are concerned, the opposition is not a threat. Nusra is not a threat for them. Nothing that Nusra has ever released that would ever indicate that Israel is an enemy for them. Hezbollah, on the other hand, is a completely different story, at least with regards to the Israelis. Hezbollah, as far as the Israelis are concerned, is the biggest threat for them. I think this year in their report, in their annual report regarding their security situation, they said that Hezbollah is an existential threat for them. So as far as they're concerned, and again, this adds to the issue of the buffer zone. The reason why they're so keen on establishing this is because Hezbollah, alongside the Syrian government and pro-Iranian forces, is a huge threat for the Israelis, and they want to do anything in order to prevent them from having any sort of access or come closer to their borders. And if that means working with the opposition, then that's fine. On the other side, for the opposition, I think the way that they see it, there's no reason why they shouldn't be working with the Israelis. I mean, the Israelis have been conducting airstrikes in Syria that have aided the opposition. And again, from government sources, if you, as far as they're concerned, when you monitor the battles that happen in southern Syria, anywhere where the government starts making advances or launches offensives that pushes the opposition back, there'll suddenly be an Israeli airstrike. So as far as the government is concerned, the Israelis are doing whatever it is that they can to help out the opposition. And I think it works in both their favors, both the opposition and the Israelis, to have this relationship in which they're both fighting the same enemy.
Yeah, Nour, on that point, a few days after your piece came out, the Wall Street Journal put out a report basically piggybacking on a lot of the reporting you did in your piece and reporting essentially the same things. And they spoke to a spokesperson for the rebel group Knights of the Golan who said, Israel stood by our side in a heroic way. We wouldn't have survived without Israel's assistance.
Yeah, I mean, I think that pretty much says it all, and I think it's interesting that there's a group that can come out and say something like that when just literally a few meters away from where he's standing, the Israelis are still occupying his land. But apparently they don't have an issue with receiving money and weapons from the Israelis. So I think the entire situation is incredibly fascinating and somewhat bizarre because apparently occupation of land is okay in one area as long as the funding and the arms can keep coming to them.
Nour, you know, it's said of Israel by some of its critics that it wants regime change inside Syria. But, you know, a piece like yours, to me, indicates that actually it's pursuing a policy of just perpetual stalemate, stoking fighting between the two sides. Because, you know, it's been pointed out that if Israel really wanted to push regime change in Syria, it could do more. It could, for example, send its forces to Syria's southern border, forcing Assad to divert his forces there and then away from the fight against rebels. And, you know, on this point, I want to read you a quote from an Israeli intelligence officer who was interviewed in Politico recently, talking about the situation in Syria and what the Israeli strategy is. And this officer referenced what former Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin said about the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s. You know, asked whether Israel supports Iraq or Iran in that conflict. And the officer quotes Begin as saying, "I wish luck to both parties. They can go at it, killing each other," unquote. And the officer goes on to say, the same thing here. You have ISIS killing al-Qaeda by the thousands, al-Qaeda killing ISIS by the thousands, and they are both killing Hezbollah and Assad.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that the Israelis are interested in regime change. And I think that there's enough information coming from domestic think tanks inside Israel that indicate the same thing. They don't want a vacuum in Damascus. It would be incredibly problematic for them because, again, they would be dealing with a government or a state that they have no idea about. And I think the opposition is fractured enough that it's very unclear as to who could lead Syria in a post-conflict state. At the same time, they don't want a strong Assad either. So it definitely serves their interest to have all of their enemies fighting each other on a playing field that they don't even have to get involved in. And so having ISIS and having al-Qaeda and having Hezbollah and having the Syrian army and having the Iranian forces all involved on the same battlefield and the Israelis aren't there, I mean, I think they're very happy sitting on the sidelines in that sense. But I think, again, they don't want to see, like you said, they haven't done enough inside Syria in order to really push for regime change because it really isn't in their interest. They're okay with Assad staying in power, but as long as he's weak. And if he's weak and if he's answerable to people like the Russians or even the international community, then that means that there would be much more control over Hezbollah and the Iranians. And this is something that the Israelis want. Like I said, they're not looking for vacuum. They're not looking for a vacuum. They're looking for a very weak state.
Nour, finally, so your piece adds a new layer of detail to the understanding we have of the various foreign players who are involved in Syria. You've laid out for us a very detailed picture of what now Israel is doing inside Syria, along with many other countries, including the US, Russia, Iran, Turkey, the Gulf states, and so forth. Your thoughts as we wrap up on what it means for the Syrian conflict if all this foreign interference keeps going unimpeded?
I mean, I think it spells out a very, very sad and bleak future for Syria. As you said, there are every single foreign force, if you want, is involved in some way in Syria. And what we're seeing now is we're seeing an area of Syria in northern Syria that's practically a province of Turkey now. We're seeing another part of northern Syria that has U.S. bases and U.S. troops inside it. We have Iranian forces inside Syria. We have Iraqi forces inside Syria. We have Russian forces inside Syria. We have Lebanese forces inside Syria. So, I mean, having all of this inside Syria already, and this is just 6 years in, I think we're looking at a very long and protracted war. And I think it will be very difficult, even 5 years from now, for Syria to be able to claw back to the level of sovereignty that they had before 2011. And I think this is something that a lot of people need to be aware of as they continue to push to have more intervention inside Syria. It's going to turn out very, very, very ugly, and a lot uglier than what we've seen right now.
Nour Samaha, a freelance journalist based in Beirut. Her latest piece for Syria Deeply is Israel's quiet campaign to gain a foothold in southern Syria. Nour, thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.